Hey guys, in this chapter we'll be covering animal anatomy. In this video I'll be talking about skeletal form and how we can utilize it to supplement our animal sketching. So first, let's break down the structure into some simple components. We're going to start with the head, the spine, the rib cage, the pelvis, and the limbs. So every animal skeleton can be divided up into these 5 parts, and these components are going to repeat in different proportions in different types of animals. So by changing that up, we can create different types of animals. And as you can see, the skeletal structure that we've achieved here is really simple, basically like a stick figure. So think of how a sculptor might use a wireframe to build his clay on top of. That's how you want to break down this animal. So let's take a look at how we might put these shapes in perspective. For the head, I'm just going to project this shape into a 3/4 view, like this. Or we could start with a rectangle and just carve into it. So this is where the shape modification comes into play. And the way you decide to break down these shapes is totally up to you. I could take this one horse and choose to interpret that skull in a bunch of different ways. Just choose a shape that you feel comfortable enough with that you can rotate it. And the spine's pretty simple. We're just going to use a direction line. And for the ribs, what I actually don't want you guys to do is use a cylinder like this. Instead, we're going to use a tapered form because ribs do have this top and bottom edge. And for the pelvis, it's just going to be a rectangle, or we could even simplify it into just a plane. And for the limbs, again, we're just going to use these ball joints and sticks. And I just want you guys to pay attention to the direction of each of these bones. And next step, let's break down each of these parts and study them a little bit more. So I'm going to start out with the skull. We always want to start out with a simplified side view so we can really break down the proportions. I'm going to start out with this rectangle and slowly carve into it. And I do like to use these short angular strokes because there is a lot of change in the topography of the skull, but I don't really want to use really smooth lines to flatten out all those different edges. At this point, I'm just thinking about placement, and feel free to always carve in and out of that initial rectangle that you put down. Don't feel like you're confined into it. We're just using it as something to bounce off of. Next up, let's put this into a 3/4 view. So we could start with a rectangle like this, just like we did with the side view of the skull, and then cut into it. And if that feels more comfortable to you, by all means, go ahead. And it doesn't even have to be a rectangle that you start out with. It could be a more organic shape like this. But I'm going to show you the way that I like to construct skulls just because I find that this gives me the most freedom. I'm going to start with a circle and I'm going to put down a cross on top, and this is going to be the direction of the top face of the skull and where the eyes sit across from it. And then I'm going to connect all those edges to make this kite-like shape. So now I'm going to cast it onto this 3/4 view. And what this is going to do is give me the height of the skull, the end where the nose sits, and in the center will be where my eyes are. And I'm going to bring down a line at the end, and that's going to be the height of my skull. And I want to make sure that all of these 3 lines are in the same perspective, and according to that perspective, I'm going to bring down the end of my nose and also the end of my upper jaw and chin. And I'm slowly going to build out the upper jaw, place the eye, and also introduce the zygomatic arch. And I'm going to build out the chin and the lower jaw as well. And now we have the base structure for our skull. And now we can start carving in lines that are a little bit more form specific. I'm going to be using a thicker line weight, and I'm going to be paying a little bit closer attention to the edges of the skull and bring in a more organic finish. I'm going to take this fine liner and slowly start building up the shadows in the darkest parts of the skull that I see. So this is going to be in between the nose and inside the eyes, and kind of hatching in different directions and varying up the values inside the eyes so that it looks like it's not one flat surface. And also, when I draw the eye, I'm not going to use a completely rounded shape, but rather I'm going to be using these short angular strokes to build out a shape that still looks, but a little bit more asymmetrical. I'm also going to introduce shadows on the other side of the jaw, in between these teeth over here, and also in the back of the head near the zygomatic arch. So now with this brush pen, I'm going to go in and render a little bit of texture and introduce a core shadow. So when you're looking at a reference photo, don't feel like you have to copy the lighting directly. I'm going to bring down some shadows. I'm actually going to focus more on showing the contours of the... There's this little divot around the nose right over here. I'm going to start filling in shadows around areas like the nose, the lower jaw. So I'm going to introduce shadows wherever I see a divot in the skull. I'm also going to bring down the shadow into my lower jaw, and you'll notice that I'm going back and forth between using a brush pen and this fine liner, and I'm doing that just to show you that whatever material that you use doesn't really matter too much. As long as you can apply a consistent value, that's really all that matters. And lastly, I'm going to strengthen the lines on this bottom edge to kind of weigh down the skull. And I'm actually going to go back into these darker areas and bring in this completely black shape and push the shadows even further. And always as a finishing touch, I'm going to go in and throw on the highlights on the highest points of the skull. Alright, so here we have our finished skull. Now let's move on to the other parts of the skeleton. For the spine, we could use a simplified shape like this, and it's going to just be a cylinder that tapers at the end, and I'm going to separate out each of these parts for the vertebrae. And I'm going to divide it in half just because it does have a front and a side. Another way we can show the ribs is to use a rectangle that's elongated like this, and also I'm going to separate out each of the vertebrae. So I used both of these shapes, but I would like to encourage you to use a rectangular form just because it shows the front and the side view very, very clearly. And I'm just going to coat each of these shapes with a Copic marker to show that clear divide from the front and the side. So even if you're using a completely rounded form, just be very aware of the volume of the spine and don't lose that form. So along the back of the spine, we can kind of go through and introduce each of these vertebrae. And you're actually going to see that the shape and the size of these vertebrae are going to change as the spine goes from the top of the neck to the base. And the spine itself actually can be divided up into several parts. So let me just draw out these separate parts real quick. So from the neck to the clavicle, called the cervical vertebrae. Then along the ribs, we have the thoracic vertebrae. Then in between the ribs and the pelvis, we have the lumbar vertebrae, then the sacral, and then the tail, which I believe is called the caudal vertebrae. And if we were to take one of these out and look through it, it can kind of be simplified into a shape like this. And if we were to look at it from a 3/4 view, here we have something that looks like a dorsal fin and two more ridges that stick out on the side. And next up is the pelvis. So I'm going to keep this one pretty short and simple. Since the pelvis is so far away from the focal point, we don't really have to pay that much attention to it. We could use different shapes depending on the animal, but mainly I like to just use a shape like this, kind of like a U. So if we put this into a 3/4 view, it would look something like this. Or we could get a little bit more detailed. So now I'm going to take this U shape and I'm going to bring in some form sensitivity. Next up we have the ribs. So like I said before, instead of using an oil drum like shape here, we want to make sure the ribs have a top and a bottom edge. We can still use a rounded out cylinder shape, but I'm going to make it taper at the end and I'm going to divide up the top and bottom face. So now let me draw out a bigger rib cage and I'm going to put in some individual ribs. So with these individual ribs, we do want them to have a clear plane change from the front to the side, and I'm going to introduce a little bit more of an organic form, but still show that little edge. And for the ribs, you guys actually don't have to draw the ribs out all the way through. We're more focused on finding the volume rather than counting out every single rib. So I'm actually just going to draw a couple up front and leave the rest as this basic shape. For the ones that you do draw, remember to draw through on the other side. And I'm going to put in a little bit of an edge. And if you guys do decide to render out the rest of these ribs, make sure that you're maintaining the volume that you've established. Okay, last but not least, we have the limbs. So here we have the front and the hind legs. And first, up top is the shoulder blade, and we have the scapula. And then going down, we have a humerus. And then in horses, the radius and ulna is going to be fused. And then we have the carpals, the metacarpals, and essentially the fingers or digits. For the hind leg, we have the femur, which is the thigh bone, the patella or kneecap. The fibula and tibia is also going to be fused together, then tarsals, metatarsals, and the toes. Let's break the leg down into a basic shape as well. I'm going to take a rectangle and flare it out on either side, almost like bell bottoms, or we could use a more organic shape like this. And I'll just do a quick breakdown of this hind leg with these basic forms. So you can see the femur coming out this way, then we have our kneecap, then the fibula and the tibia are going down. So we can do the same thing with bones that look a little bit more organic like this. So when you're drawing these bones, don't forget to reinforce the volume on them because they can flatten out really, really quickly. And for my 3/4 view, I'm going to be setting up the structure with a Copic marker. Let's start with the head, the spine, and place in each of these body parts. We're taking that stick figure form that we went over in the beginning and then applying it to this form. And I also wanted to show you guys that you can use a very thin pen to place in these lines, because in the end we're going to be using a thicker line weight, and that's going to take visual hierarchy over this thin line. So let's start out with the skull. I'm going to use the cylinder for the eyes to make sure they're aligned, and I'm also going to make sure that the perspective is correct on each of these lines that I put in. With every line that I put down, I'm going to be using that line as a reference for the next one I place down. And at this distance, because we're looking at the whole skeleton, right? So we want to keep each of these shapes fairly simplistic so that it reads well together from a distance. And now I'm actually going to move on to the legs. And with this leg in the front, I'm going to be putting in the most detail. Then I'm going to move on to the ribs. With the first couple, I'll render out some ribs, but for the rest, I'm just going to leave it empty. And then we can go on to the other leg. Because this leg is on the other side, I'm actually going to cast it back into a flat shadow, so I'm just going to pay attention to the silhouette. I'm also going to block in the vertebrae And the ones that are closer to the head, because that's our focal point, I'll make them a little bit more detailed. But as we go towards the back, again, I'm going to make them simpler. And as a pelvis, we totally could just leave it as a rectangle. And here we have the back leg. And again, the leg that's further away from us, I'm going to turn into a silhouette. And now let's render out the head a little bit more. So this is our focal point. That means I want the eye to go straight to the skull. And with animals, we usually want the head to be the focal point, right? So I'm going to start out by strengthening the line underneath and blocking in the darkest shadows like we did before. So in between the jaw, the nose, and the eyes. Now I'm actually going to be using a thin line to show a little bit of texture, show any plane changes, and core shadows that sit on this form. Let's also go into the spine and carve out a shape that roughly looks like the cervical vertebrae. And I'm also going to cast a shadow on the side that's closest to us. Let's also push back the ribs on the other side. And I want to put a thicker line weight on the leg that is closest to us and hatch a little bit to show some definition. And there we have our final skeleton. As you guys are drawing your skeletons, try not to spend more than 20 minutes on each one. Think about it as a study on proportion and form, rather than getting stuck in all the details. Alright, so now that we've gone over skeletal form, let's move on to musculature in the next video. Bye guys!